Thank you very much for being here, and I know you're probably quite keen to get to morning tea, so I will try to be as efficient as I can with this. There we go. And I also want to try to leave time for questions if that's wise, so I'll see what I can do. The task here is to try to talk about how we can integrate communities, and what I'm going to try to do, because I know there's a lot of people in this room who do a lot of different types of work and in a lot of different areas and come from a lot of different places, and so to try to come in here and tell you all how to do your jobs would be a profoundly stupid thing to do, partly because your jobs are so diverse, but also because you'd be far better at them than I would, so that would be a ridiculous thing for me to be trying to advise you on. But what I will try to do is break down the concepts that are inherent in this topic, which might, I hope, provide a way for you to think about the issues that are embedded in integration and community. And then you can apply them as you like, or just discard them as you like. I suppose that's your prerogative. I'm going to begin with the concept of integration because there's something immediately implied in that I think needs to be acknowledged. And that is that integration, the very idea of it, only makes sense when you have in existence some manner of diversity. So without diversity, there's no integration because there's simply nothing to integrate. All you have at that point is a unity. So when we talk about integrating communities or a society or employees or whatever it is we're trying to integrate, we are immediately acknowledging that amongst those people that we're integrating, there are differences. And here's the thing that I want to make clear from the start, because it kind of annoys me the way that we tend to talk about this. And that is that when we have a conversation about diversity these days, that tends to be a proxy for a conversation about immigration or a conversation about multiculturalism or cultural diversity or some other form of diversity that's expressed through race or culture or religion. If we're being really open-minded, we'll talk about diversity as including such faraway concepts as sexuality or disability. But that's about it. I mean, that's kind of the limits of our horizons when we come to talk about this. And that, I want to argue, is a profound misreading of the way that human societies work. The fact is that we have always, in all our social formations, we have always had diversity. You actually can't help it. Even if you were to whittle all of humanity down into two people who look almost identical, there will still be that diversity. And if there isn't that diversity in terms that you and I would understand, we will immediately create it. And there's a reason for that, and that is that without that diversity, without some sense of what makes us as individuals and other people who we deem to be like us different from other people that are not us, we kind of have no meaning. We kind of have no way of understanding who we are. So we will always create this diversity. And against that, there's this kind of reactionary form of politics, whether at the governmental level or just politics sort of small p, the kind of politics that exists in any social formation. Against that, there's this kind of politics that is always trying to homogenise. That's just the human story. It's just what we do. Even in what we might regard as the most homogenous societies, that diversity will exist. Even if it's diversity as simple as diversity that exists in age. There's diversity in gender. There's diversity in hair colour. There's diversity in all kinds of identities that we bring to this. This room, for example, is incredible. How many people, if I just asked you, how many people would have described this room as diverse? Right. And actually, keep your hands up. No reason, I'd just like to make it, no. Put your hand down if you would have said that on the basis of race or religion or culture, that was really the basis on which you meant that. Yeah, so there's a few sort of honest people going, yeah, all right. Right, so you can see, all right, you can all put your hands down. So you can see already, like there's a group, quite a small group of people who had some broader notion of what that might mean. I could easily bring another group of people in here who would look at this room and not see diversity at all, and they would just see homogeneity. You're all middle class. I mean, I know there's some CEOs of some big companies here. You're not middle class, but everybody else, you're all middle class. You're all gainfully employed. You're all probably vaguely into the same kinds of things and have the same sorts of tastes. This isn't diverse. This is a narrow casting of the society that we live in. If I brought in a group of people who were unemployed and homeless, they would suddenly look at this group of people probably in a much narrower way. But the opposite's true. If I stopped dividing this room, or if I decided I wanted to divide this room a number of ways, I could probably do it by geography. Who's from Melbourne here? Okay, that's just about everybody. Who's from Perth? Right, this is a very small group of people. And so suddenly I've identified that this is a very small group of people, and if I started a discourse about Perth and people who come from Perth, and I ingrained it over a period of time, this small group of people might start feeling a little bit vulnerable about that fact. How many people here like sport? This is Australia. Okay, sure. So now everyone's united in sport, but what if I said how many people are rugby league fans? And how many people are Aussie Rules fans? Okay, so now we have a fight on our hands, right? There's diversity. If I were in Melbourne and I was speaking only to a group of people who are all Aussie Rules fans, I would simply ask where the Collingwood supporters are, and that would be, the room would be rent asunder, right? But if I get those Aussie Rules supporters and I put them in a room with rugby league supporters or fans or union fans, but you're all middle class, so union's probably a bit above your station. Anyway, the point is, if I were to do that, then suddenly you would find something really interesting happen. You would find that all the Aussie Rules fans, including the Collingwood fans, who previously were not part of the species... Yeah, right, okay. You're going to get flogged this week, it's fine. You would find that immediately what would happen is that all those Aussie Rules fans would come together in solidarity. Because there are league fans in the room. I mean, they're buff heads, and we have to stand strong against that, right? And if you then added to the mix people who just hate sport, then you will find a new and weird sort of solidarity between the Aussie Rules fans and the NRL fans. What's happening in that process is that society is constantly being reconstituted. And the boundaries of diversity within this social gathering are being reconstituted. And I can reinforce that just through my discourse, if I do it enough. It just becomes something that you imbibe. So diversity exists, and this is kind of the weird radical thing about diversity. It only exists because we choose to make it exist and because we choose to recognise it. Just about everyone in this room, I assume, would recognise diversity on the basis of gender, largely existing in two categories. But that is something that we choose to recognise. You could imagine, I mean, there are certain biological barriers to doing this, but you could imagine a sociology that simply refuses to recognise the existence of gender. It's hard for us to imagine because it's so ingrained, but you could easily do that. And if you got rid of all the men, you could probably still create the grammar of gender amongst women if you wanted. One of the ways to illustrate this that I found really, well, I was going to say fascinating, but it's a horrific episode, so fascinating is probably not the right word, but was the conflict in Darfur. I don't know how many people here paid much attention to that. This was about 10 years ago that it sort of started grabbing headlines, a bit longer ago. But this was ostensibly, to the people in Darfur, in the Sudan, this was ostensibly a conflict between Arabs and Africans. I would challenge most people in this room to go and watch that conflict and tell who was whom. The distinction would just mean nothing to you. You all look African to me, I don't know. Now, the question is, are you right and they have invented a difference? Or are you just ignorant and those differences are real? And the answer is probably neither. The difference is invented, of course it's invented. But we are always in a process of inventing these differences as human beings. We just always are. And if I were to ask you who you are, anything that you say in answer to that question, I can't really think of a counterexample. I'm open to suggestions, but I can't really think of a counterexample. Anything that you would say would imply some level of collective and some level of exclusion. That is, I am this, I belong to this group of people, and in so doing, I am not that. That's kind of an inevitable consequence of the way that we articulate identity. It's just the way that our psychology works. So if we have always had diversity, then that implies two things. It means that there is no such thing as some golden age in which there was homogeneity and there was nothing to integrate. That simply never existed. We might think it existed. We are usually doing that in comparison to something else that we think is more heterogeneous. But really, it never actually existed. So it implies that. The second, it implies that where that integration, or we have found that easy, we have found it easy because there is something overarching that allows that integration to happen. That's really what's going on. So the diversity is always there. All integration really is a way of managing and harmonizing that diversity. And there are lots of different ways people try it. Some people try it through coercion and force. The story of just about every nation state, particularly in the old world, so Asia, Europe, is the story of the coercion and domination of minority groups, whether they be linguistic minorities or cultural minorities or whatever, into some homogenized whole. I mean, that's what Franco's Spain was all about. And any nation in Europe, basically, because it was built on the idea that this is a homogenous group of people, and of course it never was a homogenous group of people, had to do that. That's, and I'm not making that as a political statement, it's just a fact of history. It had to happen because we have to impose homogeneity on the diversity. And if that diversity always existed, then the thing that suggests, and if this concept of diversity is so fluid, the thing that it suggests is that a major part of what constitutes diversity, being what we choose to recognise as difference and what we choose to place value on as difference, a huge part of that is a question of identity. So, with that as background, we can start to think about diversity in our current age. Because we talk a lot, in media and in government and in every sector of society, we talk a lot about how fabulously diverse we are. We do it heaps. And it's true, to the extent that you can make a claim of absolute truth about something as intersubjective as diversity. It is true. We are probably the most diverse that human beings have ever been. Migration is a major part of that. I will readily confess that. We travel as a species far more than any other time in our species' history. The mobility of human beings is astonishing. I understand you had a speaker yesterday who spent precisely 18 hours in the country and managed to have twins while he was here. Extraordinary effort. This is the level of mobility we're talking about. That was unthinkable to a previous generation. You could pop on a plane, arrive in Australia, give a speech, have twins, go home. Can't do it. Right. This is new. But it's not just the mobility of people that creates this hyperdiversity. It's also, and this is a really profound, really important part of our current social environment, it is also the hypermobility of information. Because identity is built in part on how we take in information and then choose to create ourselves with that information. That's why media is an important part of our lives. As much as we might hate it or love it, it's an important part of our lives. What is on the news triggers a national conversation. The mere fact of that conversation creates communities. They might be communities of hostility or harmony, but they are communities, one way or another. And it's the fact that we are bound by switching on the TV and seeing the same Prime Minister every day that kind of creates a community in our minds out of this really artificial thing, which is a group of populations that exist at vast distances and whose lives don't really impact directly on one another. We kind of imagine ourselves in this overarching community because there's an infrastructure that facilitates it, and that infrastructure, historically, has been mass media. It's one of the elements of infrastructure. I mean, there's, governmental infrastructure and so on. But the governmental infrastructure only works because there's this other community infrastructure there. What now? What in an age where organisations like my employer are petrified because all of their audience is being taken away by the internet? What now? What now when... How many people in this room... I actually don't have any idea what the answer to this is going to be. How many people in this room would, as a matter of semi-regular routine, look at an overseas newspaper online? So the New York Times, The Guardian, not the Australian version, but the UK version, The Times, right. That's a lot of people. How many people would look at an overseas newspaper regularly? That's more than I was expecting. Every day. How many people do every day? All right, I think you're showing off now. Look how cosmopolitan I am. And I bet it's all in Russian, right? Yeah, that's it. I mean, this is astonishing. That fact, think about that fact, that so many people in this room would be reading an overseas newspaper every day. Part of your brain is now living in that place, whether you like that or not. But that's part of what's going on. You're more engaged, probably, with the politics of that place than you otherwise would have been. And at some small level, and for some of you it might be a very small level, but at some small level you are beginning to invest in the conversation of that place. And this is before we get into satellite TVs and how that interacts with migration, right? I mean, I know that, like in my community, it's really, really easy to spot the house that's owned by the wogs because it's concrete and there's a satellite dish on the top. And that's how you know, right? Because they moved to Australia and you can just beam in like TV from Italy or the Arab world or whatever it is, just like that. And you can watch the latest soap and all of that sort of thing. And my parents' generation, that's what you did, right? And there's a reason that you do that, and that is because there's an investment of identity there. But it also then reinforces that identity. So if you, as Australians, and I know not everyone in this room is Australian, but if you as Australians moved overseas, and Australians in the UK are a very good example of this, you would probably hold on to certain aspects of what it was that whether it's trying to find a place to watch the grand final. I didn't mention a code because I'm ecumenical like that, but you get the point. Whether it's trying to do that, or it's trying to stay in touch with politics back home, or the news back home, or reading the Sydney Morning Herald or the Australian, or whatever it is that was your routine here, you will try to hold on to aspects of that. And what is happening in that process of mass human movement and mass movement of information and access to information from all over the world, and I haven't even got to social media and the information that circulates that way and the communities that form that are entirely new as a result of that. What's happening there is something quite radical, and that is the separation of identity on the one hand from geography on the other. So your identity no longer has to be determined by where you are or what political organisation you are counted as being part of. You can identify in all sorts of ways. You can identify with causes, you can identify with peoples, you can identify with class. There are so many ways you can do it, and just about any way you choose to identify can now be global, which is one of the reasons that we're seeing a resurgence in, say, the white supremacist movement, right? Because the white supremacist movement, something that was kind of a bit of an oddball movement in certain parts of the United States or in parts of Europe or whatever, now they create global links. And so you see a regeneration of this kind of radical politics. It's the same sort of thing that we're seeing with Islamist terrorism. Once upon a time, Islamist terrorist groups had to be kind of local actors that were fighting against their own government. Now, with the advent of this kind of information exchange, they can become global. It's the same sort of thing that happens with businesses. Right? It's just part of our sociology, so everything kind of expresses that. And when you feel... or when you identify what that means, that sort of, that splintering of information that we take in and the way we relate to that information, so that there is no longer a coherent public square around which everybody gathers, then what you're doing is you're taking already an inherently diverse species and you're maximizing that diversity, because the identity of all the people that are gathering in this species now begins to splinter. Because you can identify yourself in so many different ways. So we have now an age of hyperdiversity that has nothing really, or nothing necessarily, to do with migration. Migration is a massive part of it, but it exists without it. It's one of the reasons I think, and this is a broader conversation, but it's one of the reasons I think our politics is now on warp speed. Because there's no consensus. It's not easy to, we're cats now, you can't hurt us in the same way. So it's very easy to build some kind of political consensus. The reason this topic is posed is that it collapses back onto the ultimate question then of participation. Because what integration is about maximising the participation of all these diverse people within your business or your nation or your city or whatever it is. That's what it's about. And so everything I've just said about identity matters to this extent. That in my view, the way that or the only way really you can maximise participation from lots of diverse people that are getting more diverse is to somehow make all those people in the diversity feel like they belong to whatever this community is that you're trying to sustain or build. If they don't feel like they belong, they become disengaged, they don't participate. That's pretty much what it is. We're a country with compulsory voting, but many countries are not, and it's one of the ways you measure political engagement in those countries is what the voter turnout is. That is a measure of participation. And one of the things that is more likely to make you feel like it is worth voting or getting involved in a civic organisation or whatever is that you feel like you actually belong to the overarching body. And this is where it gets tricky. Because the art of leadership, whether it be at a national level or local level or corporate level or whatever, the art of leadership is ultimately the art of creating an environment, creating some overarching narrative that allows all these impossibly diverse people to feel like they can buy into it, notwithstanding their diversities. And that's really hard. I mean, that's becoming harder. But anyone in this room, I would say to you, that feels or identifies as a leader, which is another collective identity, by the way. But anyway, anyone in this room who feels they're in a position of leadership, I guess what I would say to you is that that is your task. First, you've got to recognise the diversity that exists within your organisation. And that's a hard enough task. I mean, you could do PhDs in sociology just on that. Because it exists in ways you don't even, like, that are not apparent. It's not just about spotting brown people, right? It's not that. I mean, that can be part of it, but it's not that. It's much more complicated than that. So you've got to spot the diversity that exists, and then figure out what is it, what are the values I can articulate, or what's the idea that I can articulate that allows people to maintain all of those diverse identities and bring them together and stay within the organisation. And what I mean by that is that if your approach is instead to say, this is the narrative, if you have an identity that, or if you have a different identity, then you have to choose that sort of assimilationist approach, then I can promise you, it's not a question of what you prefer. This is the way it will work. Some people will comply, some people will not. And you will lose people. It's as simple as that. You have to like it, but this is the paradox, the sort of self-defeating nature of assimilationist approaches to things. If you disrespect the diversity that's there and say, well, what I really want is conformity, you'll get conformity in a very reduced way. And then you'll get hostility from those who refuse to conform because they'll feel that they've been slighted. Right. I'm going to shut up there because I think we're already a little bit over for morning tea, and I promised some time for questions. And I hope I've given you something at least to ask about, or at least hurl projectiles if you have them. Okay, no questions, thank you. I'm not taking any questions.
Have a couple of questions.
I am taking questions. If you.
So, if you want to have a question, I'm probably the worst person in the world to do this, but I'm going to throw the box at you, and it's built-in mic. So, throw up your hand, and I'm just sign a waiver because the way
This is great. People could get injured. This is. Are there people who want to ask questions but are afraid to catch the box?
A question without notice.
Sure.
I suppose for us, we looked for activities to integrate many of our participants in the programs we run. Our members do employment programs, they do disability programs, they do youth housing programs. I suppose us leveraging the power of some of these information mediums and social media, how important is that to get, take-up of the programs we run?
What sort of program are you talking about? What sort of programs are you talking about?
Oh, like the youth drummers there before, and
Right.
trying to build community and participation.
Right, I see. Well, I've got to be careful because I should warn you, never ask me a social media question. You will just get an angry tirade that does not end. I just have an issue with social media generally. So I know I'm on my own here. I know that means I am not worthy of being listened to on the topic within the current orthodoxy. So just bear that in mind. What I would say, though, is where you are running programs, I think you're running them... Effectively, you're trying to sell something to an audience. And it's a question, really, I suppose, for you as to who you think that audience is and who matters in respect to that program and also who doesn't. Because the thing about hyperdiversity is that nothing matters to everybody. Nothing is relevant to everybody. And working in the media, I know this really, really well. It is impossible to conceive of a segment or an idea or 3 seconds of television or radio that everybody wants to see. It's just impossible. And so it's true whether it's a broadcast program or it's a community program like that. So I think part of it is about the design of the program in the first place. Who are you trying to reach? What identity are you trying to build a bridge to? And once you've identified that, then I think you can tailor programs to fit that, right? So I don't know enough about the drumming program to comment specifically on that. But, if I know of other sort of drumming programs like, Japanese drumming or whatever it might be, there are a couple of different ways a program like that works. One is it gives a sense of validation to people who have some kind of identity connection to that art form. Right? And it might be an art form that really matters to people who hail from that part of the world, and the fact that it's here matters so much more than the activity itself. And whether they're doing it or not, there's a symbolic buy-in that immediately happens as a result of that. But then there's an interaction with another group of the community for whom this is not some ethno-cultural thing. What this is a way of connecting with either other people or the world generally, or some part of the world, or they've been to Japan and they were fascinated, or whatever it might be. And that means that, there's a different motive there. But either way, you are making, in a program like that, a massive symbolic statement about the people that you're interested in trying to bring together. And so I guess what I would say is, I'm going to leave alone the question of leveraging social media and whatever, but don't measure the importance or the success of a program like that on the basis of how many people turn up or whatever. I know there's sort of basic realities about how many you need to make a program viable or whatever, but it's not just about that. Sometimes it's about the statement that's being made. There's the social or philosophical statement that's being made by the existence of a program being run. I don't know if that helps you at all, but...
Hi. Can I just say, I've never seen a microphone like this before. Waleed, this is probably the asking you to deliver the next speech rather than to answer a question. But if one of the key things that leaders need to do is to recognise the diversity in order to build a community, what do leaders need to do to take other people in that community with them in terms of recognising that diversity?
Yeah, it's very hard to answer that in general because it's so different in every circumstance. But I think that's where the idea, what I was saying effectively is that there has to be some overarching narrative, some overarching thing people can hang on to. That overarching thing, the strength has to reside in that. So I find this easier to talk about at the level of nation states because my background is in political science and that's the way I think. So let me do it at that and then you can analogize from there. There is a reason, I would argue, that the nations of Europe are finding the era of globalization much more difficult to deal with and to grapple with than a nation like the United States, for example. And the reason, and you're right, this is a whole other speech, but the reason is that if you look at the way the nations of Europe were formed after the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century and the mythology that surrounded the creation of the European nation state, you have a nation state that is built on an overarching narrative of linguistic and cultural and racial and sometimes religious homogeneity. And I'm not criticising that. That was actually a brilliant idea at the moment that this was conceived, and it ended two very bloody wars, the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War. But that was nonetheless the narrative, and it was well adapted to the time. And there were problems it created internally, because as I say, all these nations actually were diverse, and the homogeneity had to be imposed. But nonetheless, it saved a lot of lives as well. But in an era of globalisation of information and people, that starts to come under strain because as people start to pile in from all over Europe, let alone the world, just with the EU you can have this problem, the homogeneity breaks down, and so it naturally raises questions that are difficult to answer about can someone who is not, for example, Germanic, be German? The United States doesn't have an issue with that because the whole idea of the United States is not an ethnic or a racial or a religious idea. It's a political idea, which is that it is a nation that is all about and is constituted on individual liberty. And every idiosyncrasy of America can be explained through their obsession with individual liberty, and you can have your critiques of it, but the point is it's a very clear overarching narrative that is not cultural or racial or religious. Even when Americans talk about God in a political sense, they never describe what that God is. It's not a Christian God, it's the God who bestows the rights via the Declaration of Independence. Right? It's a different God, and you can bring your own God to it. So, in a sense, what defines America is not culture, as anyone who has travelled from, as I did, from Miami to Tulsa, Oklahoma, knows. These are different countries. But they cohere because there's an overarching idea that everyone can latch onto. Has its downside. All I'm saying is it's well adapted to an era of globalisation and mass immigration. That's the only comment I'm making about it. I guess what I'm saying is you just analogize from there. What is the overarching idea that you can come up with that is broad enough so that the diversity, in a sense, doesn't become an obstacle? You don't need to convince everyone to love everyone else's diversity. That's not the way. I think there is too much effort spent on trying to eradicate bigotry and prejudice. You will never do it. Human beings, there are probably good reasons we have those instincts within us that have allowed us to survive as a species. You won't get rid of it, but what you can do is try to figure out a way so that that doesn't become as big a problem as it otherwise might. And so I guess it's just searching for the narrative that you're after. Sorry, I now have gone over. That means you will almost certainly not get morning tea. I think you will be allowed to walk to where the coffee is being served and walk back, but not have any actual coffee. I think that's the... Is that where we sit at the moment? I'm going to shut up now. All right, thank you very much.